Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your hosts, Chris Jennings and Dr. Mike Brazier.
Today, Dr. Mike Brazier is joining me, along with Dr. Fritz Reid, the Director of Conservation Programs for the Boreal and Arctic for Ducks Unlimited. Fritz, welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast.
Thanks, Chris. Good to talk to you.
Hey, first, let's go ahead and start off, kind of give people an idea of what you do for Ducks Unlimited and what your role is involved with our boreal conservation.
Sure. So I have Boreal and Arctic in my portfolio. So for the Boreal, we've been working in both Alaska and Boreal Canada for almost 30 years now. We joined forces with a couple of groups, the Pew Charitable Trust, Hewlett Foundation, and we're able to meet with some great folks in Canada. Of course, Leadership Ducks Unlimited Canada, but also a number of provincial and territorial leaders, some industrial leaders, and then the groups that have really stepped up are the Indigenous First Nations of Canada and the Boreal. Folks from the Cree, from the Acacho, Decho, Sawtoo, Gwich'in. These people really have looked doing land use planning, and that's what we work with in a big way.
Very cool. Can you kind of give our audience an idea? I know when I went up there 4 or 5 years ago with you, and I would tell people, hey, I'm going up to the Boreal Forest to hunt. And they're like, where is that? Can you kind of give people an idea of where and what the Boreal Forest is, as a landscape?
Right. So Boreal means northern. So in the world, when we talk about the northern forest, and everybody thinks of it as a coniferous forest, it really is a forest complex that runs from western Alaska across Alaska and Canada to the shores of Labrador. And then in terms of where do you first encounter it if you're coming from the south? Edmonton was the historical line of the Boreal Forest. And then you go north and you can actually go right to the ocean. The Mackenzie Valley, very forested, important wetland complex, is right at the Arctic Ocean. As you move further east, you run into tundra in the Hudson Bay lowlands, but the Boreal Forest basically will run east to west, and then north to south is Edmonton, right to the tundra.
Okay. Yeah, I think that gives everyone a pretty good idea. And if not, you can always just check it out, pull up Google Earth and look at that.
It's a big area, too.
Oh, it's massive.
It's like I was reading a book here recently, Fritz. I think it's a book that you contributed to. It says the Boreal Forest accounts for something like 58% of the land mass of Canada. That's impressive.
Yeah, it is.
It's 1.6 billion acres in North America, and it's just incredible. And when you fly over this area during the summer, you just see wetland, lake, river. It's just landscape across, and so it's really an amazing place, and it's a wet environment. Many people call it the Forest of Blue because there's so much water, so much peatland across that landscape.
Which actually, that kind of leads me to my next question is, why is the Boreal so important for waterfowl and waterfowl production? If you can explain a little bit of that, which you kind of gotten into with the fact that it is, a very watery landscape.
You bet. Well, waterfowl hunters know there's two great breeding grounds across North America. The all-important prairies, which have really high density nesting, and then the Boreal Forest, which has overall very low density nesting. But because there's so many wetlands, so many lakes, you can have one or two broods on each of those lakes. And then as you look at the millions of wetland complexes that exist there, you're going to have some fantastic production. And it's why year to year we're getting 35 to 40% of our breeders across North America to be found in the boreal forest, and chiefly in the western boreal forest.
In that western boreal forest, that makes up a portion of Alaska as well, correct?
It does. We generally define the western boreal forest as Manitoba west, so going right into Alaska. And Alaska has some really core breeding areas. We were fortunate there were some great pilot biologists back in the day in the 60s that recognized and knew where some of those core areas were. And so that became, under the Anilka Act, those became the national wildlife refuges for Alaska. So if you look at where the core breeding grounds of the boreal, Anoka, Yukon Flats, these are the core refuges that had that big production.
Cool. And that kind of brings me to another point. It's as far as, Ducks Unlimited science and even the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Canadian Wildlife Service survey, the boreal is a very difficult place to work. And I would imagine just because of this, one, its vastness, and two, it's very hard to get to.
It's a logistics, it's really, really tough, and it's very, very expensive. When you make these flights, you think about you going up to Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories or going up to Alaska, you branch off from Fairbanks, but you're just getting started at that point. You got to get into the bush. There's small planes, there's helicopters, getting around, how are you going to do it? Whether you're doing banding, whether you're doing research, whether you're working with First Nations on helping identify core areas, the logistics make it very, very tough.
Yeah, because there's no road going in there. I mean, it's not like you're driving around up there. I mean, it's you're boating in, flying in. It's tough to get to. Let's talk about some of the the production levels as far as individual species. I mean, I think one thing, waterfowl hunters, you recognize, I think most waterfowl hunters recognize that the prairie breeding species, but how important and how, selective are these species like widgeon?
Sure.
Mike and I were just talking before we came on air, a significant number of even blue-winged teal ended up in the boreal this year. Kind of speak to that and speak to the individual species and the importance of the boreal for these species.
What we know is that overall, there's certain species which year in, year out have adapted to the boreal forest regime. So species that we know in the southern areas, green-winged teal, American widgeon, very, very important, but also a number of the diving ducks, lesser scaup, greater scaup, ringneck ducks, all have the highest percentage of their breeding population in the boreal forest. At the same time, you'll find northern pintail, mallard, as much as a third of the continental population will be found in the boreal. But what we find in the boreal year to year is there's about 15 species where at least 50% or more of their breeding populations are there.
Be the first to know when ducks are on the move. Sign up for DU's waterfowl migration email alerts and receive ongoing in-depth updates on the latest habitat conditions, weather changes, and hunting reports for your flyway. Visit ducks.org/migration alerts.
Okay, so Fritz, you mentioned difficulty of accessing the boreal, getting in there to study the ducks and to do anything in that area. And so it's natural that when we think back over the years of how we've learned about waterfowl ecology and where we've learned about it, that area is at least until recent years has been a bit more of an unknown than, let's say, the prairies. Is that a fair statement?
That's an absolutely fair statement, and one that should be emphasized, because we often, we were very, very fortunate. We have 100 years, 150 years of work on trying to understand waterfowl, basically from the prairies, and only, beginning in the 40s and 50s, expanding in the 60s, do we see people go into the boreal and the Arctic and try and begin to understand some of the energetics and some of the food habits of these species in a boreal context.
So, Fritz, from a ecology standpoint, I'll confess that I don't know a lot, certainly not firsthand, about the ecology of species once they nest in the boreal, whether it be species that have a higher affinity for the boreal, such as the scaup and scoters and other species such as that, or whether it be pintails and widgeon and greenwings, and how their ecology and breeding effort may differ between the prairies and the boreal. So just one general question here, if you know the answer to this, if we as a community know the answer to this, do we see a decrease in, let's just say, for example, renesting effort among species that nest in the boreal? Because it sort of stands to reason when you think about this, the farther north you go, that growing season, that breeding season gets shorter. Does that show up in terms of fewer renest attempts and less renesting intensity?
I think that's the general thought by most people, that as you start restricting the amount of days where it's ice free, but what we're seeing too is that in August, oftentimes we see a big push of young birds that have just hatched out in the boreal. And so the question is, are these birds that are renesting originally from the boreal, or are these at times when birds get pushed north from the prairies when they're dry? Generally, our thoughts are that birds, if they overfly, aren't going to fly that far into the boreal to renest, and that if they do move pretty deep into the boreal, they may try to survive, but are not necessarily going to be successful nesters. But the reality is, we just don't know. We haven't been able. Only recently do we have techniques like satellites where we could track birds to truly go into the boreal and look at the timing of both initial nesting and potential renesting. And those are questions still remain.
So in years such as this, where birds that made it to the southern prairies encountered incredibly dry conditions, a lot of those are going to continue on fly into the boreal. Do we have any idea what percentage of those are actually going to try to breed versus a certain percentage that might just forego breeding for this year and you say, hey, I'm going to try to wait it out. I'm going to try to survive till next year and give it another shot. Do we have any clue about that kind of part of ecology?
No, that's a great question, and we don't know. We do know that species like blue-winged teal will generally attempt in the southern portion of the boreal some level of nesting. We see successful broods in that area, but what overall percentage of those birds that are leaving the prairie, we don't know. We do know that when the prairies are wet, that's when we have our largest continental populations. The prairies are essential in maintaining those big continental populations. But we also know that there is some breeding when the prairies are dry from birds that we typically think of as prairie birds, blue-winged teal, northern shovelers, pintails, etc.
Yeah, the way I've always thought about it, and I've heard it described, is that the prairies, because they are so dynamic, they are the engine for the population booms. But when the prairie's dry, of course, we lose a lot of that productivity. And those are the years when that boreal forest becomes so incredibly important, because it's our safety net either for some level of lower level of sustained production, or just giving those birds that can't find breeding habitat in the prairies a place to go and make it through until the next year and give it another shot and hope for better habitat conditions. And that's really what makes preservation of the boreal within Ducks Unlimited's conservation work so important.
And at the same time, what we're seeing is that certain populations are really growing within the boreal. That we clearly see that in Alaska. Alaska, back in the 50s, when we first started doing aerial surveys, had a peak of 40,000 widgeon across all the surveyed areas. Now we know there's over 1 million breeding widgeon annually in the boreal of Alaska. And that's also true now, over 1 million birds of green-winged teal, of pintail, of scaup. And so those populations have grown over over the last 50 years.
And, there's another interesting dynamic here that I don't think we'll have time to get into on this podcast, and I don't know if we really understand all the answers to it, but as those birds move into the boreal, certainly the western boreal, and into Alaska, then that's going to have implications more so for our western hunters and migration down through the Pacific Flyway. And so where these birds breed is going to obviously influence where they go after the breeding season. And so longer term, as we see these shifts, or maybe I shouldn't even say shifts in this regard, but as we've seen increases, let's just say in Alaska in the widgeon population, it stands to reason that we might see that manifest in numbers on the wintering grounds. Is that kind of bearing itself out?
To some degree, but there again, we would sure like to see some more, cross breeding and wintering information. You're absolutely right. We do see big increases in widgeon along the western coast, marshes in Washington, Oregon, California. But at the same time, we also know from satellite data that there are birds that breed in Alaska that are ending up on the East Coast. So the North is an interesting place. Looks like it's not a direct south migration, that there's movement across the continent and then south. So we need more information.
Yeah, it never ceases to amaze me how much we really don't know about some of these important questions. And it's the more you know, the more you want to understand, and the more you realize how little you actually do understand. That holds true here as well.
That's definitely the truth. The other thing that's really interesting about the boreal and the ducks that use it is that as you fly over these landscapes, you see a wide variety of different types of wetlands, and they're important to individual species by type, so that where green-winged teal tend to nest, they typically are along fluvial stream situations, and they'll be in the brush around those stream situations, whereas the scoters you'll find oftentimes on islands, in big water bodies, big lakes, etc. And the scoters tend to be somewhat colonial. You may find a number of nests within a certain area. So the different types of wetlands, whether it be a small, intermediate, large, you may see different species orienting to those for their nesting periods, and that's pretty cool. And that's why the strategy we use is huge blocks of area, both upland and wetland. And because the boreal is such a big place, when we look at conservation, we're typically thinking in 1 million acres, 2 million acres. What can we do in this regard?
Fritz, I appreciate you joining us. And, if people want to learn more about the boreal, you can always visit ducks.org and get a bunch of information there. But we're going to bring Fritz back, and we're going to talk about what Ducks Unlimited is actually doing, everything from, conservation-wise, even on the policy level, and some of the partners that we're working with in the boreal. I think you might find very interesting. Thanks a lot, Fritz.
All righty. Talk to you guys.
Special thanks to Dr. Fritz Reid for joining us from our Sacramento office, the Western Regional Office. Also, thanks to Clay Baird for producing the Ducks Unlimited podcast. He does a great job. And thanks to all of you, the listeners, for supporting wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.